The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Scientists call it H5N1, but to the rest of us, it's simply known as the bird flu. Could this new strain of influenza be the next global pandemic?
I should make clear from the outset that we do not know whether the bird virus that we are seeing overseas will ever become a human virus.
And is America prepared to handle the possibility of this deadly threat? To find out, Policy Watch is joined by Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, welcome back to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Good to be here.
Well, let's start discussing a wonderfully pleasant topic, avian flu, sometimes called bird flu. First of all, what is it?
Well, it's an influenza. An influenza is a virus that is no stranger to the human population. We get seasonal influenza every year, very predictable during the winter months in the temperate climates. How
many of us get seasonal?
Well, each year, about 25% of the population will get infected. In the United States, there are 36,000 deaths and 200,000 excess hospitalizations per year related to seasonal flu, the garden variety, predictable seasonal flu.
So if this happened, if we didn't have seasonal flu and suddenly we had one, we would say, this is one terrible thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why you cannot talk about bird flu or pandemic flu, which I'll define in a second, without considering how you approach seasonal flu. Because we don't take seasonal flu as seriously as we should. It's a serious disease. But as with so many other diseases, since it occurs predictably, you know exactly what's going to happen each year, plus or minus a little bit deviation, you don't take it seriously and you don't maximize your responses. The number of people you vaccinate, the drugs that you have developed, you accept less than optimum countermeasures. So with that as a background...
I'm sorry, we have to really make a point about this. When you say less than optimal measures, we're still using 19th century technology with vaccines?
Well, first of all, we don't have companies that are particularly interested in entering the field of modernizing our vaccine approach to influenza because it is just not particularly profitable for them. It's an unpredictable field. It has its risks in getting involved. It's seasonal. It changes from year to year about how many people really you're going to get vaccinated. So you can make a certain amount of vaccine and wind up not using 10, 15 or more % of it, and there goes the profit. So there is not a lot of incentive. That will become relevant when we talk about pandemic flu. But just to put in perspective what bird flu or pandemic flu is that each year we have what's called a drift of the virus. So this year, if you look at influenza, you designate it by letters called H, which stands for hemagglutinin, and N, which stands for neuraminidase. These are just two proteins that are on the surface of the virus. So for the last many years, we've had an H3N2. It's a little bit different from year to year. It changes just enough to warrant upgrading your vaccine, which is the reason why you have to take a different vaccine each year. But it doesn't change enough to pose a public health threat. So there's enough experience immunologically that your body has been exposed to something similar to last year and the year before seasonal flu. So although you might get sick and a certain number of people, 36,000 a year, will die, it will not be a global public health catastrophe because of the experience you have from year to year. Now, every once in a while, and in the 20th century it happened 3 times, you get not a drift of the virus that changes a little, but you get almost a completely new influenza virus. And that can occur by a number of ways, by mutations, by exchanging genes, but it could also occur if the virus jumps species from an animal to a human. And fundamentally, influenza A viruses are viruses of waterfowl. Even though humans are also a host, it's a very important virus among waterfowl. It doesn't usually make them very sick or kill them, but every once in a while there's a serious epidemic among birds, seagulls, waterfowl, and then domesticated chickens, such that not only does it kill the chickens, but that it has the capability of rarely and sometimes not so rarely jumping from chicken to human. So when we talk today about the bird flu, we're talking about a new virus for humans called H5N1, different from the H3N2 that circulates seasonally. Now that virus has emerged, the first cases we saw was in 1997 in Hong Kong, when there were chickens that were infected. Many of them died and the rest of them were killed by the Hong Kong authorities. There was 18 infections in human, unusual, rare, not a lot, 6 deaths. That kind of toned down because we got rid of all the sick chickens. And then in 2003, it reemerged such that as now we're having an explosion of cases. Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, the European Union, some countries in Africa and in India also, where this highly virulent bird flu is killing an enormous number of domesticated fowl, and it's being spread from country to country by migratory birds that don't necessarily get very sick, but fly from one country to another, commingle with the domesticated fowl like chickens and turkeys. They get infected, and as we saw in Southeast Asia, as children come in and play in the backyard with free-roaming chickens, they get infected rarely because it's still inefficient in going from bird to human. There have been 185 cases and about 103 deaths, which if you look at the millions and millions of chickens that are infected and the hundreds of thousands of people that come into contact with the chickens, to only have 180 some odd infections is still very inefficient. It's also extremely inefficient in going from human to human. There have only been 1 or 2 documented cases. So if you're a chicken, we're having a pandemic already. If you're a human, there's a threat of it, because the concern is that as we see more infections, this virus, which has a tendency to adapt itself well, might adapt itself to become more efficient in going from human to human. That has not happened yet. It might not ever happen. But the threat is there, and the concern is that if the virus does that, it will then be able to present itself in a way that would mimic the worst of all catastrophes, which was in 1918, when we had a similar virus that confronted the human population for the first time. There'd been no experience with it before, and that was one of the worst public health catastrophes in our history, with more than 50 million people dying in the 1918 pandemic. There was worldwide. There was a much less dramatic pandemic in 1968, where there were not significantly more people than you would see in a seasonal flu, but it was still a pandemic because it was a brand new virus. So those are the 2 extremes. There were 3 pandemics in the 20th century, 1918, 1957, and 1968. The 1918 one was horribly catastrophic. The 1968 one was relatively mild. So the possibilities of pandemics are very, very, very broad. Having said that, you have to assume the worst case scenario in your preparedness. And that's the reason why you're seeing a lot of activity about preparing for something that might not ever occur. But if you don't prepare for it, then you will have been really quite negligent given the consequences.
Let's talk about that. But first, when do we know that we've passed this danger point? Or could this just lurk there for years?
It will continue to lurk if chickens continue to have this highly pathogenic avian flu, because when you have a lot of chickens infected and there's interaction between chickens and humans, there's always the threat of more infections in humans. But you would hope, and we're seeing this in the developed Western Europe, which is a highly industrialized as much as we are, they have a number of migratory birds that have died and landed and died in Western Europe. Yet the situation in Western Europe, as it's evolving, is much different than the situation in Southeast Asia, where most of the chickens are free roaming and there's a lot of contact. In Western Europe, similar to the United States, there's very good agricultural controls over domesticated fowl. It's an industry. They raise them in facilities that are well controlled, so that even though there will be, and almost certainly we're going to see, a migratory bird in this country that's going to be infected with H5N1, the chances of it contaminating the chicken flocks in countries in which there are good agricultural controls of the poultry industry is much less than if you're in Indonesia or Turkey or Nigeria or Niger. So A, we need to have good surveillance, but B, the threat continues to be greater in those countries in which there is much commingling between migratory birds and chickens and between chickens and humans.
Well, I won't ask you to say this because you're a federal official, but what I just heard is I should maybe avoid free-range chickens.
Well, actually, there aren't a lot of free-range chickens, number one, and two, you shouldn't avoid anything right now because there's no bird flu in the United States, and I guess you alluded to France, and I think that's one of the things we need to guard at. First of all, as health officials, we need to emphasize that we must assume the worst-case scenario. That doesn't mean that the general public needs to assume the gloom and doom of a worst-case scenario. So that's that dichotomy of prepare for the worst, but the general public shouldn't be worried about the worst. The most frequent question I get asked is, how worried should we be? And my response generally is that you shouldn't be worried. I should be worried because I'm responsible for some of the health issues, and you should just lead your normal life and not worrying about it. What happened in Europe a while ago was when the migratory birds started to infect, to land in Western European countries, France got a contamination of one of their turkey and chicken facilities. They acted totally appropriately. They immediately killed the animals and culled them, and then the poultry industry was okay with France. Yet, in Italy, in which there was a swan who was infected, that was detected, with no infections at all among chickens in Italy at the time, the poultry sales plummeted in Italy purely because of the perception of what you just said, should I stay away from chickens? And the chickens weren't infected.
Wait, you've been describing what is a classic public policy, right, description of risk, which is likelihood times harm equals risk. Likelihood, we don't know, might happen, might not happen, could happen, could have happened already, might happen next year, might never happen. The potential harm. Let me push you a little bit to, not to frighten anyone, but just to understand the worst case scenario. Right. What is the worst case scenario?
Yeah, the worst case scenario, and again, and I can say, even though there are people who cringe at this, but it's unlikely that the worst case scenario will occur. But having said it's unlikely, on the next breath, I say you still have to prepare for the worst case scenario because you would be negligent if you didn't. And that's a concept that people sometimes have difficulty in grasping, how you can be preparing for the worst case scenario even though it might not necessarily occur. Well, because if it does occur, the consequences, which your question is, are enormous. If you look at the worst case scenario and you do a mathematical model, which we've done, based on the now relative population in this world compared to 1918 and the devastation that occurred in 1918, the worst case scenario is that you could have, a couple of million people in this country that might die from bird flu. And you could have, if 50 million people worldwide died in 1918, it could be 100 or 150 million now. Now, those are mind-boggling data numbers. Again, unlikely that would happen. But in your preparedness, you have to assume that it's going to be a major public health catastrophe.
Well, help me walk through this.
Right.
So a seasonal flu can affect as much as 25% of the population.
Right, and a flu that spreads even more because it's a new virus that people don't have protection, it could be up to 40%.
And from what we know, what percentage of that 40% would need hospitalization? Or need
well, it depends. If you're talking about a bird flu virulence, because remember, seasonal flu, people get sick, but the mortality of seasonal flu is a fraction of a percent. In 1918, the mortality was 2%. So even with as low as a 2% mortality, so if it's a 2% mortality, for everyone that dies, there are probably 10 or more people that would require hospitalization, and maybe 20 people. So you take a substantial proportion of that, you're talking about millions and millions of people that would need hospitalization, which brings us to the point of we don't have the medical infrastructure to handle millions of people who would need hospitalization. We don't have the respirators for that. So that gets into this whole issue of the worst case scenario is going to be terrible if, and like I said, it is unlikely it would happen, but if it does happen, it would be something that would take the whole world unprepared.
Do we have a sense of how long it would take to begin to spread? Would we know, well, it started in Los Angeles and it'll be
well,
a
given
week
jet
to 3
travel, again, it depends on how efficient it goes from human to human. If it maximizes its efficiency and spreads as rapidly as a seasonal flu does, you're talking about over a period of weeks to months of it essentially going around.
We can't make vaccines that fast, can we?
No, we can, and that's one of the critical issues of preparedness, because even though there is a probability, if not a likelihood, that we will not get, quote, a worst case scenario this year, there is still the looming possibility that sooner or later we're going to get a pandemic flu of some type, sometime. And one of the ways you can prepare that is to build up the vaccine production capacity to the point where you don't have to start from such a low baseline to get it up to the numbers that you'll need. Like, for example, currently with seasonal flu, we vaccinate about 83 million people is the peak that we've ever vaccinated in this country. Strictly speaking, if we vaccinated the people who could really truly benefit, who are at risk, we would be vaccinating over 180, 190, maybe 200 million people. You add on to that the people who actually are at very low risk, but you should protect them because by they're not getting infected, they won't spread it to somebody else. You're talking about well over 200 million people. So if we were vaccinating routinely in this country, 200 million people a year for seasonal influenza, we would have in place...
You'd feel more comfortable.
Well, we would have in place the infrastructure so that if we had to, on a dime, turn around and say, wait a minute, we have this new virus that we just identified that's rapidly going from person to person, and it's a different virus than we've ever seen. Let's start making vaccine for that virus. What you would need to do would not be a gigantic leap from a very low baseline. You will have already have a system in place that can make that many doses within a 4 to 6 month period of time.
But that's quantity, and as I understand it, it takes a long time to figure out what the actual virus is, and then are we using eggs to make?
We still are using eggs, and part of the
we should describe that for the audience.
Yeah, when you talk about egg-based, you mean that the influenza viruses and vaccines that we all get are two types. The most common one is the whole virus itself that you grow in eggs because they grow well in embryonated eggs, and then you purify it, kill it, split it, get rid of some of the extraneous components, and you vaccinate somebody. Then there's the live attenuated where you still have to grow the virus, but you grow it in eggs. Growing viruses in eggs is a highly reliable but antiquated methodology that has very little flexibility and surge capacity. So what we're trying to do now in preparation for the potential need to scale up rapidly is to transition and convert the production capability from an egg-based to a cell-based. And by cell-based is you have these cell lines that you have much greater control over than having to worry about buying millions of chickens that are going to lay millions of eggs that you're going to then inoculate with virus and grow it, that you can actually have cell lines that continually are in process, that when you inoculate them with the virus, you can grow a lot of virus in the cell lines. We need to make that conversion. We also need to get new generation of vaccines using recombinant DNA technology. So there's a long way to go, and this relates to what I said a few moments ago. We have not maximized our capabilities to counter any influenza, much less a pandemic influenza. And as we get better and better at how we handle seasonal influenza, we'll be that much closer to handling pandemic influenza well and get us out of that crisis mode that we get into whenever you're dealing with a brand new influenza virus.
And in fact, that could be one of the benefits of what we're going through now.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if there's any good, and there will be some good, that comes out of this intensity of degrees of preparedness, it will be that at the end of the day, we will have rejuvenated our capability to deal with seasonal influenza. You know, of the 36,000 people who die each year in this country, 32 to 33,000 of them are elderly individuals over 65 years old. They do not have as robust an immune response to a vaccine as a younger person does. We should be working on, and we are now, ways of boosting that response so that when you give a vaccination to an elderly individual, instead of it being only 50 to 60% effective, it will be 85 to 95% effective. Then you could eliminate a significant number of those deaths among the 33,000 people who are 65 or older who die each year from seasonal flu.
What's your best bet about when we get this technology and this capacity?
It's going to be a matter of years. It's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be next month or this summer. It's going to take a concerted, sustained effort that will happen over a period of a few years.
So let's say that this pandemic happens, and it happens before these new vaccines or capacity. What's the plan?
Well, the plan is to do as much as you can with what you have. And you have to remember that in addition to vaccines, in addition to antiviral drugs, there is plain old classical, historically proven public health measures that you can use to help protect the population. Things such as if you're sick, if your children are sick, don't send them to school. If you're sick,
do the schools stay open?
Well, again, that's going to be a policy decision that will be made at the time. You know, it might be the better part of valor if a certain proportion of the teachers and the students get sick to close the school, to keep them out of circulation so that they don't start cross-infecting each other. Same thing holds true for work, that you should be able, and this is the reason why in our preparedness, for example, Secretary Leavitt and a number of us have been going around to state and local authorities talking about plans at the state and local level, but also to business leaders to talk about planning now how you would handle a 20–30% absenteeism, how you'll be able to do work from home. Can you hook up so that you can do online work from home? Can teachers teach online from home? These are the kind of things that we can't be thinking about when it happens. We've got to be thinking about it now, even though it might not ever happen.
And whether it's recommended or not, people will probably shy away from taking airplanes?
Oh, yes. So it's what we call, the terminology is social distancing. And by social distancing, you mean staying out of crowded places and not having large events where you gather people in large auditoriums or in arenas or in movie theaters or in airplanes, and try and keep social distancing as best as you can. You don't want to shut down a country, obviously, but there are some simple things you can do that would, in fact, decrease the infection rate merely by keeping people at distance from each other.
No subway?
Now, I wouldn't say no subway. I think that's jumping the gun. I think you need to take it as it occurs.
Wait a minute, am I going to wear my little mask in the subway?
Well, that's possible. It's those type of public health maneuvers that are relatively low tech that you want to maximize if, in fact, you don't have enough vaccine to go around, if you don't have enough drugs.
Now, with all due respect, we're not that far from Katrina. You know the line, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you.
Right.
What's your best estimate of whether these pieces are getting into place?
Yeah, they are, but what's also being emphasized, and Secretary Leavitt has been emphasizing this at every stop that he makes. He's visiting essentially every state of the union to talk about the need for the state and local authorities to right now start planning and assuming some of the responsibility. This cannot be, don't worry about it, the federal government is going to rescue you, because when you're dealing, I mean, you talk about Katrina. Katrina was a horrible catastrophe in a very limited part of the country. You were talking about Mississippi, Alabama, and mostly Louisiana and New Orleans. So there was a lot of help that was coming in from all other different parts of the country. Imagine Katrina in every region of the country, in which every component is involved. A lot of these regions are going to have to fend for themselves with some help, obviously, from the federal government, but they should be making their plans now about how they're going to do it, as opposed to saying, well, we'll just sit back and if a catastrophe happens, Uncle Sam is going to rescue us. That just is not going to happen. By the very nature of what a pandemic is, that won't happen.
There were a lot of shoulds in what you just said.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of it's happening?
Well, actually, on November the 1st, the President Bush announced the pandemic influenza strategy, and then the next day, Secretary Leavitt released a several hundred-page pandemic influenza plan that, in fact, has these checklists of what we need to be doing at the state, local, international, business, school, and individual level. So there's probably more preparedness for this than any other potential catastrophe that I think in our experience. Whether or not that's going to work, and again, when you get the worst case scenario, nothing is going to look like it was well prepared. It's like preparing for an earthquake. You can build structures, you can have people with their drills of what you do would have an earthquake, but if you get a Richter 8 going straight down the middle of San Francisco, there's going to be a whole lot of hurt going around no matter how well you prepared. The same thing holds true for a pandemic. If you get the worst case scenario, it's going to be tough on everyone, but you need to prepare for it, because if you get something less than that, you may have a major impact in a positive way about preventing disease and suffering.
Right. If we get this one right, it will be a very good sign. And there are, as you mentioned, there are so many other things that would benefit from a fix to our vaccine system. Dr. Tony Fauci.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
I am PBS.